Well, a number of years ago, my wife Britt and I, we went to Calgary to celebrate our anniversary. And we checked into a fancy hotel in downtown Calgary, and we made reservations up on the revolving restaurant on the Calgary Tower. And just before our reservation, we decided we were going to go to the observation deck of the Calgary Tower. And if you haven't been there for a while, one of the things they've done is they've taken a chunk of the floor and they've actually removed it. And they've replaced it with a chunk of glass. And so we went up on this observation deck, and there is this chunk of glass, and there's all these people that are gathered around it, and some of them are standing like right smack dab on that glass, and when you stand on that glass, I mean, it's hundreds of feet right down to the street below, and they're standing there on that. Some of them were like very timidly kind of stepping out on it, right? Wouldn't you? I kind of would if I was doing that. Some other people, they just kind of stomped right on it. Some of them jumped up and down on the glass. I think they have a death wish. And slowly the crowd began to dissipate, and then it became our turn. And my wife was like, let's go stand on the glass and get our picture taken. And I'm like, no, that's okay. Because here's what you need to know is I don't like heights. But on top of that, I didn't believe that glass would actually hold me. Okay? So Britain, I'm like, you go and do it, right? Because we're always more confident on behalf of somebody else, aren't we? And so I said, why don't you go and you stand on that glass? And I kind of stood back and watching her. She's like, come. No, I don't believe that it'll hold me. And you know, as I was thinking about it, I think this is sometimes the way that we treat God, don't we? Is that like we are very capable of encouraging other people to step out onto the glass, this invisible thing that stands between us and plummeting to our death. We're very good at encouraging even close people to us to take steps of faith, to trust God. You can do this. But when it comes to our own lives, when it comes to the things that matter to us, sometimes we're like, well, we'll put a little toe over the edge, right? But really all the weight is still back on the safety and security of not the glass. And today, I want to talk about trust with you. I want to talk about our trust of God. Because sometimes it's hard to step out onto that glass, to step out and let God take care of us, and to trust him that he will actually do that. And so today we're going to talk about trust. And I want to invite a friend of mine, Tina Kish, to come up and join me. And she's going to help me to understand more about trust, because sometimes I have trouble trusting. And Tina is someone, have a seat. Tina is someone that I have known for 25 years. I don't think you're that old. I know that I am, but I don't think you are. I think they turned me there. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't done. They just want to hear from you. But we've known each other 25 years, and actually we established this morning that you dedicated my youngest daughter, and I didn't realize that until this morning. And so this is just fantastic. Tina was a pastor at one point. She's a mom now, and she's just, her and her husband, Aaron, if you don't know them, they are two of the people when I need to feel good or to be happy, I call them, or I text with Aaron, and he always puts a smile on my face. They are just a joyful couple. But I know in your story, and I wasn't around for all of your story because I moved to Calgary for a while, but in your story, there's been times, I think, where you had to trust God. Have you ever had to trust God?
Many times, many times. I could be here all morning for hours. But I will share just a little part of what, one of the times that I had to trust God the most was when Aaron and I decided to have a family. We were very excited. We'd been married 5 years. We enjoyed each other's company. We always wanted to be parents. And we were very fortunate because we got pregnant right away. And I know that's a struggle for a lot of people. It was some struggle that when I was a pastor, there was people in our congregation that really struggled to get pregnant. Well, I got pregnant, and then 10 weeks later, I lost the baby. And it was very difficult. It felt like it's something that I couldn't share with people. And I had to keep going on and doing my role and doing stuff. And then a few months later, we got pregnant again, which was very exciting. And except by about 5 months on, I became really sick. There's something in your blood called platelets. And it's the clotting mechanism in your blood. And below 100, usually they won't let you go to surgery. And my platelets during my pregnancy were 50 and below. One time I showed up for a blood transfusion and they were 2.
Wow.
And at 2, you can just spontaneously bleed, just keep bleeding. So from 5 months on in my pregnancy, I was at the hospital twice a week. My mom would take me. Aaron was always working, and it took 4 to 6 hours to have blood transfusions. And I was so tired after, I couldn't even drive. I was exhausted. It was your body adjusting to a new product in your body. And at 6.5 months, we lost the baby. And we didn't realize we had lost it. I didn't have a good sleep. I was actually at Bob Peters' funeral. And I told Aaron, I said, I haven't felt the baby move today. It's like, well, maybe it's just a thing. And I knew something wasn't right, and that night I didn't sleep well. I phoned my mom, she came, we went to the hospital, found out the baby had died. And not only did the baby die, but because he had died, he was poisoning me. And my platelets were still very low. I seizured and coded, I had a blood clot in my brain, and I don't remember the next couple of days. I was so sick. They needed to get the baby out, and my platelets were so low, and I was seizuring. My blood pressure was so high. They told my husband, Aaron, we've got her on enough medicine to make a big elephant go have a baby, and we can't get this out of your wife. And it was really scary. When my husband heard that, they said, you need to call your family. That's a hard one to deal with.
Yeah.
And I don't remember this. This is what people told me. But that night, Aaron called the elders. He called, all our family was there. There was an anesthesiologist outside my room all night. My OBGYN, she was there all night. My GP was there all night. My mom remembers seeing, and Aaron remembers seeing the blood, all waiting because they were so nervous, because everybody bleeds during a delivery, and my platelets were 18, and I shouldn't have made it. And luckily, eventually, I was able to deliver, and I didn't die. And so it was a real miracle. God had touched me, and I got better quite quickly after the delivery, and then I relapsed, and I ended up in ICU for a week. There were so many things during that time. I actually ended up being in the hospital for about a month because of that. There were so many times that we saw that God always, even though we were struggling, my health was so bad, He always gave us something to be thankful for. Having our parents there. After I seizured and coded, my family wouldn't let me be by myself anymore. So they just took turns around the clock sitting with me, making sure that nothing bad would happen. And the things they caught, and we had the right doctors at the right time and things like that. But it was difficult. Near the end, I remember because I had so many blood transfusions, we ran out of veins. And they had to start doing the IVs in my feet. And I don't know if you've ever had IVs in your feet, but it's not fun. It's not fun at all. And I remember looking out the window as they're trying to get the veins in my feet, and I see birds just flying around. And I remembered the scripture that God talked about, that, He knows, even if a sparrow falls, how much greater God will take care of us, how much more He knows about us. He knows the number of hairs on our head. And it gave me strength to keep going on. It was very hard leaving the hospital with no baby, coming home, having my health be so reduced. I was so weak and still so sick. I needed to go back twice a week to the hospital for blood transfusions. Just to give you an example, I told this to Kirk earlier on. When I came home from the hospital, I was so weak, I couldn't even stand to brush my teeth. I had to sit down. That was a hard thing. Our whole family had to readjust to my new health. And when I came home, our family and friends had taken all the baby stuff out of the house, so I didn't have to deal with that. We didn't have a funeral for our son. We decided to have a celebration ceremony. There's people here that were at that ceremony, and we just publicly thank God for saving my life. I almost died again in the ICU, and there's 2 times that He saved me. And I know when my health is reduced, But I'm here, I was standing, and there were so many items. It took us about an hour just to publicly say all the different things that we were thankful for. It wasn't easy, regaining my health, going back to work. As Kirk mentioned, I was a children's pastor. I loved my job, I loved my church, wonderful people, godly people. But there was parents everywhere and children, and it was a loss. It was really hard. And so I had a really wonderful senior pastor. He was my boss, and he noticed that I was struggling to focus. And so he suggested, let's do a project that you could focus on. And he said, we'll partner with our church in Mexico, and we'll do up something similar to like Operation Christmas Child. We'll send Christmas boxes down. And you and my wife, I'll send my wife to go with you. We'll go and help with these boxes. I had to get the okay from my hematologist to go, and it all had to work out so that my last blood transfusion was right before I left for Mexico. He wasn't happy with me going, but it was a real good focus for me. And I enjoyed being in Mexico City. It's one of the biggest cities in the world. I think there's 23 million people.
Yeah.
And I did kind of stand out because I was a little taller than most people with my blonde hair and blue-eyed. People would come up and touch my hair. But the Spanish people were wonderful. We were able to go. We stayed at the senior pastor and his wife, Arturo and Elizabeth, at their house. And they just took us everywhere to minister to people. They took us through orphanages. There were so many. It broke my heart. There were so many children in Mexico living in poverty, living on the streets, not going to school, selling little chiclets for money. It was a really hard thing going, how come I couldn't have one? Why can't I just pack one up and take it home to Canada with me? But that wasn't the case. And the last day of Mexico, it was a Sunday, and right before we were heading off to church, the senior pastor's wife, Ev, she got a phone call from her husband saying that their son and his girlfriend were going to have a baby, which was very exciting. And she was very excited to have a new grandbaby. And then we headed to church, and in Mexico, it's a little different than having services in Canada. They come 2 hours before church to pray. It's that important to them to pray. So we showed up, and there was only one other lady who didn't speak Spanish. She came over, and she's like, I'll pray with you guys because we'll pray in English. And that was great. And Ev was sharing her news of having a new grandbaby, and the lady said, oh, this is just amazing because this morning I found out my sister is going to have my sister's baby as a surrogate. And so that was very exciting. And then we had to pray, and I couldn't pray. I was supposed to be praying, but I couldn't. I was too hurt, upset, really feeling sorry for myself. So I just didn't pray. And then I heard a voice from behind me say, Tina, you need to stop feeling sorry for yourself. I will give you children. I looked around. Literally, I thought there was somebody behind me. The voice was so clear. It could have been somebody standing right there. And I looked around, and nobody was there. And I realized what I had done. I had jerked back, and then I just quickly went to pray, and I thought, okay, God, is that you? Are you talking to me? I'm just going to keep praying and praying. And so we finished our prayer time, and everybody started gathering and just talking and fellowshipping with one another. And this lady, this Spanish woman, came up to Elizabeth, the lady we were staying with, and she said, can you translate for me? And she said, sure. She said, whatever God told you, Tina, about having children, He's going to do it.
Wow. Wow.
Wow. The peace, the overwhelming peace came upon me. I just got excited because I didn't know how we were going to have children or anything, but God knew. And so I needed to trust Him. I knew He was faithful, and His plans are not always our plans, but His plan is better. So I came home from Mexico all excited, saying, God's going to give us children. We're going to have a child. and my husband's like, yeah, Tina. We don't want you to get too excited. We don't want you to be disappointed. My family was like all kind of curbing it because it had been rough. It had been really, really rough. And we still didn't know if we could have kids on our own. And so we went to the doctor, and he said, there's no way you can have kids on your own. The baby will die, and you will die. And that was another blow. It was a huge loss. And I have to tell you, it's not something you can swallow easily. And I've had to deal with it for years. But trusting him and knowing that, we dealt with it, and we appreciated the doctor for being so honest that we said, okay, that's not God's plan. So what is God's plan? And I kind of was very excitable at that time. I'm like, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to do adoption. We're going to do surrogate. What are we going to do? And Aaron's like, slow down. We got lots of time. We need to make sure you're healthy. And so we did start looking into adoption. And there was no adoptions here in Canada, so we knew we'd have to do an overseas adoption. We went to the doctor again. I have to consult him with everything because of my health now. And the only place he would allow me to go was the United States because the health care, and that they spoke English, they would understand my conditions. And he also mentioned he had been working for months to figure out what was wrong with me because my platelets were so low, and yet I didn't bleed out like a normal person. And he found out that I have a low platelet blood disorder, and I also have a clotting disorder, which caused the blood clot in my brain. And so to have two of those things, I don't know how many of you are medical, but to have both of them, it's like 1 in a billion to have both. The clotting disorder saved my life, and yet it killed the baby. But if I didn't have it, I would have died with the low platelets. So learning that I have a chronic condition was hard to deal with, but I was excited. I had so much peace about it because God had spoke to me. And we decided that we're going to go to the States and do an adoption, and we found out that you can only do one adoption agency. There's more than 200 in the United States, and you have to kind of put all your eggs in one basket. You can only send your papers to one place. Wow. So we talked to other people, we went to seminars, and we chose an agency. And one of the reasons we chose that agency was because the birth mom got to make a lot of the decisions, and I felt that I knew a little bit of what it was like leaving a hospital without a child. Not to the same degree that she would, but I knew that putting her importance and her needs first was where we needed to go. So for this agency, you needed to make up a scrapbook, describing your family, showing who you are, what kind of life you are, and that's how the birth mom chose you. And so my good friend and I, we spent days making this beautiful scrapbook in the hopes that someday somebody will pick us and we will get a child. We sent it down, and then there was kind of a breather because we had been to so many adoption seminars, and everybody says, it's going to take years. At least a year, probably 3, maybe. Be careful, there's adoptions that fall through. Oh yeah, don't get your hopes up. Even the adoption agency that we were working with said 50% of the birth moms changed their mind. So we sent the scrapbook off, and we thought, we got time. That's not what God thought. A week later, on a Thursday night at 9 o'clock, I got a phone call saying there was a little boy, 3 days old, and the birth mom has chosen you. I still remember where I was at the time when I got the call. In that state, the birth mom has 5 days to change their mind. And that was a Thursday night, so by Saturday, if she hadn't changed her mind, he would become our son. That was Thursday night. Friday, I was leaving for a ladies' conference, a retreat, and I was supposed to be the speaker of it. And I was just found out this crazy news that I could only share with my parents, and I had to focus to talk to people. And all I wanted to do is think and pray. But God pulled me through, and I spoke on the Friday night, and then Saturday morning, I spoke again, and then after that, I couldn't do it before I did my sermon, phone Aaron. I phoned him after, and I said, have you talked to the adoption agency? Did the birth mom change your mind? He's, no, we have a son.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, that's amazing. He said, the birth mom has made a request. She would like us to name him, and she wants to know his name. I said, oh, we haven't even talked about this. We thought we had years, and we didn't. And I wasn't even with him. This was all on the phone. And so I said, can we tell her tomorrow? And Aaron's like, sure, not a problem. So that night at the ladies' retreat, I told all the women there, everyone was from our church. They knew what the struggle is that we went through to have children. And everybody was just so, so excited. And then that night, Saturday night, I don't know how I went to bed and slept with all of this in my head. We didn't even have any baby stuff in the house, nothing. And now we were supposed to be leaving Monday morning to get that baby. Well, that night I did sleep, and when I slept, God talked to me again, and he said, you need to name your child Noah. Because your life with Noah is going to be very similar to the biblical Noah, in that you're going to have to step out in faith and trust. Noah had to build the ark way before it started to rain, years in fact. And lots of people didn't understand. And that's what your life is going to be like with this child. And again, I heard it so clearly, even though I was asleep. I woke up the next morning and I phoned Aaron. I said, Aaron, this is what's happened. God spoke to me again, and we're to call him Noah. And Aaron's like, that is so crazy. He's like, why does he keep talking to you? I'm like, I don't know. And then my husband, who's wonderful, he's been such a good support through it all. And he's really smart. He's really good with math.
Yes.
And he goes, Noah was born on that Tuesday. And I said, yeah, that would have been 5 days ago. He said, did you realize that that's exactly 9 months to the day that God told you you would have a child?
Wow.
The word is gobsmacked. I'm never really at a loss for words, but he blew my socks off. He totally did. It was just an example. He totally confirmed that this was our child. Noah was supposed to be with us. He has a plan for us. He has a plan for Noah. So that Sunday I finished my speaking. The afternoon I spent at the church. There was a kids' Christmas concert rehearsal I was in charge of. I had nothing for the baby. My mom and my husband went out shopping. I think they got a crib or something. And I had to run around the city after that because I needed certain medical stuff to fly in an airplane. And it was 5:30, and all of the pharmacies on a Sunday at that time closed at 6, and we needed this certain medication that very few pharmacies keep because it expires and it's very expensive. So that was crazy in itself. And then I had a good friend come to my house that night before we left. She brought a suitcase full of baby things, a lot of things I didn't even know I would need. And she said, don't worry, you will need these. That many? Yes, that many. So 4 o'clock, we were at the airport, and by 4 in the afternoon, we got our child. We got Noah, and he's a gift.
Amen.
He's
Amen.
a miracle. And God always has a plan, even though we don't see it. I know he's real. He's healed me, but I still have chronic illness. I still struggle with my health. It's not something that I talk about a lot because I don't want people to feel, oh, poor her. I get the look, but you don't. You look so good, people will say, even though you can't tell how your blood levels are, but it affects how I feel and how I react to things, my energy level. I haven't, to be honest, Aaron and I, in the last 5 years, I haven't really been to the church much because my platelets were so low that the doctors wouldn't let me come. It's a compromised immune system. And I've been watching at home on YouTube. And I appreciate the people who spend the time and take the time to video the sound people so that I could be a part of it even though I was at home. And God heals. If you've never met somebody who's been healed, it's me. Have you ever met somebody that God's speaking to? That's me. God has a plan for each one of us. Amen. And he's real. And he talks to each one of us in our own way. So today I really want to encourage you. I'm not sure where you are, what your struggle is, if it's physical, emotional, maybe in a relationship, maybe there's issues at work. God has a plan. And all we have to do is trust.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks for sharing your story. Let's give her a hand. Thanks. Thank you. Well, the question after you hear a story like that is, how do you have faith? How do you have trust like that in God? You know, it's one thing to see someone standing on the glass of the Calgary Tower, jumping up and down and trusting it. It's another thing for you to step out and do that. How do you have that sort of trust in God? You know, we've been going through the Christmas story over the last number of weeks, and we've been asking the question, why did the people in that story celebrate? What made Jesus so special that they would come and worship him and celebrate and go away joyful? And today, in just a few minutes, I just want to share with you the reason why, you know, you can have faith like Tina, and how to build that trust in God. And in Matthew chapter 2 is the story, and you may be familiar with it. There's a lot that's kind of been told in the world about it. It's the story of the Wisemen. And only it's a little different than probably what you've heard in that song, We Three Kings, or maybe seen in a cartoon or something like that. It goes like this. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" You know, this story of these wise men, who are also called magi in some translations. And what they were is they were people who studied the stars. They were astrologers, basically. They would study the stars with the idea of discerning what the future was, figuring out the horoscope in modern day language. These were people that were far from God. These weren't people that gathered in a church on Sunday or that worshiped in a synagogue in any way. These were people who were far from God, not just spiritually, but also physically, because they traveled a great distance to come and to see Jesus. And these people who had been watching the stars, and we've called them three wise men, but actually Matthew doesn't tell us that. In fact, the number of people that came, we have no idea who it was. And it wasn't until the 4th century that actually all of the traditions and all of the folklore that we kind of associated with the wise men, that they're from Orient far away, that doesn't come around till the 4th century, till 400 years after Jesus is born. All Matthew tells us is that these are people that were far from God, but who were observing what was going on in the world around them. And what they observed was that one night, everything changed. One night, in a moment, the world was different. I don't know what it was. We don't know what it was. But they were watching the stars, and they saw what they described as a star, and suddenly this changed everything for them, and it propelled them to go and to look more closely at what might be going on in the world. And they began to search, probably, within ancient texts. And one of them that they would have come to is one called the Hebrew Scriptures, a series of scrolls that were written from millennia before. And in there, they found something. They found a promise, just like Tina heard a promise. They found a promise written in Genesis chapter 3. We read about this promise that at the moment when humanity decided to rebel against God, that God actually says to them, you know what, there's not always going to be this rebellion. That at some point, someone's going to enter into the picture, and he's going to change the story. And at the same time that he's telling the first humans about the effect that their sin, their disobedience is going to have in the world, that he actually began to promise that change was coming and everything would be restored. At the end of Genesis, that same book, what we read is another promise that out of the line of Judah, would come a leader who the whole world, all of the nations would bow down to. Hundreds of years later in the book of Exodus, a leader arises, a man by the name of Moses. This isn't the leader promised in Genesis. This is another leader. This is seen today as one of the greatest leaders that Israel has ever had. And in the middle of that, God says to them, he says, you know how great Moses is? There's going to come another leader who is greater than Moses, who speaks my words because they are his own words. In other words, the leader that is coming is going to be God himself. And then we go on, and God tells us another one. He says that this leader that from the line of Judah is going to be like a star that shines brightly. Isn't it interesting how the Magi saw a star the night Jesus was born? And we go on, and promise after promise is given. Daniel promised, David promises that the Messiah is going to come. Jeremiah promises the Messiah is going to come, the King of the Jews that we read that the Magi saw a sign and they came looking for. Isaiah promises. Micah promises. Promise after promise throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, promising that somebody was coming. And that night, the Magi are watching the sky and they see that something has changed, and suddenly they go searching for what's going on. And they discover that what's going on is part of a plan that God has had from the very beginning. From the very beginning, God has had this plan that Jesus would be born, and he's been revealing it. Romans tells us that all of creation reveals the glory of God. That means that every single one of us, whether this is the first time you've heard the story of Jesus or whether this is the 100th time, all of us, just by looking around the world, by seeing a sunset, by walking on a cool winter day, by seeing the Grand Canyon, by looking up in the stars, all of us have seen the glory of God. But not only that, if we've ever looked at ourselves, that even we are part of creation and we reveal God's glory. And God has been speaking to us, just as he was speaking to the Magi. But sometimes we don't respond. We wonder, why does it look like there is a God, but we never really think about it and we never really turn to it. But if we would be like the Magi and look at what God has to say in Scripture, we would discover that he has a plan. And this plan he has been rolling out since the beginning of time. And in the book of Revelation, in chapter 22, verse 16, Jesus says that he is the root. He is the offspring. He is the morning star. He is everything that God has been promising. And Jesus, friends, Jesus reveals that God has a plan. This is what compelled the Magi to leave their country, to travel probably 1,000 miles at least, to visit a baby, because they realized that this God of creation, who has created every wonder in the world, including you, has a plan. That's what Tina came to realize, that God has a plan. It may not be your plan. It may be different, but he has a plan, and it is a good plan. And it's interesting, if you know the story in Matthew chapter 2, the Magi, they come to Jerusalem and they meet a man named Herod who has proclaimed himself to be the king of the Jews. He isn't, but he thinks he is. And he had studied Judaism and he had tried to follow it, not very well, kind of unfaithfully, but he still considered himself to be the king. And they meet him and they say, where is this king of the Jews that's been born? And Herod doesn't respond very well. In fact, everybody around Herod doesn't respond very well. In Matthew chapter 2, it says that they met with Herod and he heard the news and he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. All of Jerusalem with him. Because Herod was paranoid, because he recognized that God had a plan and he didn't want any part of it. And so he rejects the plan. Herod, though, calls together all the religious people, all of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And they go and they look within the Scriptures. Because the question's asked of them, where is the Messiah born? Where is the King of the Jews born? And they come back and they say, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophets, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers, Judah. For you shall come a ruler, from out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And what we discover is that the religious people knew where the Messiah was, but they hadn't been watching for what God was doing in the world. Isn't it interesting that people far from God understand more about what God is doing in the world than the religious people did that night? You know, sometimes we're like that, aren't we? Sometimes, yeah, we understand God has a plan. Yeah, that's all good, right? But we're not actually watching for what God is doing. We're not actually trusting what it is. We know he has a plan conceptually in our head, but we're busy doing our own thing, just like the religious people when Jesus was born. And maybe we need to turn and respond like the Magi do and recognize that God has a plan and we need to trust it. Step out on the glass. The Magi find out where Jesus is born, and they go to see Jesus. Do you know what the religious leaders did? We actually aren't told. Matthew leaves that out, and it's kind of interesting that he does. He tells us about Herod, who has no interest actually in Jesus. He tells the wise men, or the Magi, to go and to meet Jesus and then come back and give him a report. But we know later on in Matthew chapter 2 that the only reason that he told them to do that was because he wanted to murder Jesus, to get rid of the competition. But nowhere in Matthew chapter 2 do we read about the religious people and how they responded. They knew God's plan. They had the details for where the Messiah was. In fact, he's only 8 miles away from where they were. 8 miles. If you knew that everything that you had been waiting for just was 8 miles away, what would you do? Wouldn't you go there? Matthew tells us nothing. And what he's doing is he's saying, you know what? He says, what he does tell us about those religious leaders is he says that all of Jerusalem was upset with Herod. And they were upset because Herod was this paranoid king who killed his wife and 2 of his sons because he thought they were going to overthrow him. And so all of Jerusalem, including the leaders of the religion, are upset because they fear what Herod is going to do next. And they fear Herod and what his response is going to be more than they are worried about the Messiah being revealed. And by the absence of mentioning anything about the religious leaders, Matthew tells us a whole lot of what they did. Nothing. They had been waiting. You have to understand, these are deeply religious people who spent their whole life studying the scriptures. They had all the knowledge. They were followers of God. And yet they had no faith that the Messiah could change anything. And they have more fear of what's going on in the world than fear of God or trust in God. And it's interesting, the Christmas story reveals something. It reveals that God has a plan, but it reveals something more. It reveals God's faithfulness, even when his people are faithless. You see, your and my faith does not change God's plan. It does not move it forward, it does not move it back. God is faithful to what he is going to do. That's what it shows us that Jesus was born, because his people had lost faith that this was ever going to happen. But God never lost faith. And he was faithful even when his people were faithless. And sometimes we are quick to realize that God has a plan, but we do not trust, or we do not have faith that he will actually do what he says. Have you ever experienced that? We believe that the glass will hold us, but we won't step out on it. And we're faithless. And that's how we treat God sometimes. But Jesus reveals that God has a plan, and he is moving it forward, and he does want you to be a part of it. And Jesus reveals that God is faithful. He is faithful no matter how long it takes. He is faithful. But he reveals one more thing. when we begin to trust God, something happens within us. Those magi, they go to Bethlehem, and we're told in chapter 2, verse 12, that after they worship Jesus and present the gifts, that actually they turn and they are warned not to go back to Herod. And we don't know who warned them. Matthew doesn't give us that detail, but what's implied is that they received some sort of divine intervention that told them not to go back to Herod. And the reason why I say that is because right before this passage and right after this passage, there's divine revelation that happens. And after this passage, Joseph is warned by an angel not to go back, but to escape to Egypt. And the Magi are the same way. They receive divine intervention. You see, remember, here's these people that are far from God, who are just looking in the sky and they notice that everything has changed suddenly. And they begin to explore to try and discover what it is that has changed, and they discover that God has a plan. And this compels them to move forward, to move themselves physically closer to where the Messiah is. And then, even though the rest of Jerusalem doesn't go with them. I mean, imagine this. If you were part of Jerusalem, okay, and some guys come to town and they say, we've heard that the King of the Jews has been born. We've seen his star. Where is he? And you know the answer. Wouldn't you go too? And yet nobody but the foreigners, the people who are far from God, go to see Jesus. All of Jerusalem stays home. Wouldn't they question why they suddenly are the only ones that are going? Why isn't anybody? It's the King of the Jews, not the King of the Magi. Why are the Jews not coming with us? And yet they put their faith enough that something has changed, that God has a plan and they want to be a part of it. And so they go to Bethlehem and they meet Jesus. And suddenly everything changes further. Because Jesus reveals that God can be trusted, that he's working out a plan, that he's faithful to his plan, and that he'll actually do what he says. And whenever we have an experience where we see God can be trusted, you know what it causes us to do? It builds our faith. And the Magi have this divine revelation. And they trusted enough to commit treason. That's what they were doing. By not going back to see Herod, the king, okay? By not obeying a royal decree or command that they had been given to come back and report on what was going on, these Magi were effectively committing treason. They were betraying the king. They were signing their death notice. Because if Herod is so paranoid that he'll kill his wife and 2 of his sons because he's afraid, just afraid that they were going to overthrow him, there was no actual plot. He was just paranoid. Imagine what he would do to 3 Magi foreigners who came to town declaring there was a new king, but didn't come back as he had commanded them to do. And these Magi, they trust God more than they trust Herod in the end. How does that happen? It happens by little steps of faith, of realizing that God has a plan, and then watching to see where he is at work, and believing that he is faithful, that he who has declared he has a plan will bring it through to fruition. This is Tina and Aaron's story. This is the story of the Magi, of realizing God has a plan, of realizing that God is faithful, and then taking steps of faith, stepping out onto the glass and trusting him. Do you trust God? I mean, really, do you trust God? Do you trust him enough to put your own life at risk like the Magi did? Do you trust him enough to put everything in one basket, right? Do you trust him enough to step out on the glass? Maybe it's time that you start to look around and start to look for signs of where God is at work. To realize that he has a plan for your life as well. He loves you. He wants to know you. And he is working that plan out in your life and in mine. And maybe today it's time to take a step of faith and trust him to be faithful. Or maybe there's something going on in your life. Maybe there's something awful, something where you just need to trust him, and your faith has been wavering. Friends, God's faith in you and God's love for you has never wavered. Step out on the glass. You know that story of me in the Calgary Tower, I finally did step out in the glass. I hated it. I really did. And sometimes when we trust God, it doesn't feel good. But he never lets us down. And you know what? I was thinking about this. I stepped out on the glass with Britain in a very, very short amount of time, but it built my trust. And a few years later, we were in another place that had another piece of glass in the floor. And I stepped out on it much more easily. Because you know what, if we'll just take that first step, if we'll listen to stories like this, if we'll listen to the story of the Magi, it will build our trust, because we realize God can be trusted. And when we realize that God can be trusted, we will trust him with more and more and more and more. How do you need to trust God today? I want to invite the worship team to come back up and lead us in our closing song.